Hi guys, welcome to the Kenworld Experience. I thought I would just share just one lesson, and to share this, I thought let me first pose a question: How have the African youth been denied responsibility or freedom? Because the two are intertwined. In the previous videos, I've told you that true freedom, transcendent freedom, or sustainable freedom is not freedom to do what thou wilt. That's devilish. True freedom is the right to choose the right responsibility. Or better said, is the freedom to choose the right responsibility. Now, what has happened in Africa today? In Africa today, we are still under this horrible colonial formal education system that doesn't teach Africans to think, or even more evil, teaches Africans to think about the wrong problems. This is a direct attack on the transcendent development of Africa and the biggest violation of African freedom, because the African youth are denied the freedom to contend with the right problems, the freedom to choose the right responsibilities. The education system derails the young people from knowing how to solve their problems, or it makes them look at European problems as African problems. So we have a young generation that cares more about European problems than African problems. And so we are not dealing with our own troubles, we are dealing with European troubles. That's why you see Africans fighting for human rights and things like that, pretending to be Europe. Because when you're fighting for human rights and you don't have the ability and the power and the reputation and the substructure to be able to contend with such a dragon, then you'll be forced to run to Europe for aid and help, because only Europe can handle that problem. The human rights problem is a European problem. It's a problem for people who don't have responsibilities, and so they are left with one thing: complain, complain, complain. The African problem is a problem of hunger for responsibility. Africans, and this is not just the youth, but even the Generation X and below and before that, has been infantilized. We had Europe that was an Oedipo mother that has continued to cripple Africa with aid and loans and grants, stopping Africa from handling their own problems, from contending with their evils, thinking they can throw money at a problem. And we have colonialism that set up the King's Rifles, the African tyrant army that blocks Africans from freedom of expression. And by expression, I don't mean verbal expression, much as dialogue is very important. I mean freedom to contend with African problems. So soon as you talk about a bad leader, you're thrown in jail. Soon as you talk about African unity, you're assassinated. And assassinating these African leaders is not a European, it's an African. When you look at the case of, for example, DRC, the warlords that are protecting the Europeans that are stealing African resources, minerals, gold, and all those that are literally robbing DRC are African warlords. the African youth that have been corrupted, to turn against Africa because they care about money and European problems as opposed to African problems. It's very important that we begin to understand that Africa's biggest enemy is Africa itself, because we have chosen the wrong freedom. By fighting for human rights, we are fighting for freedom to do what we want. This is a momentary freedom. It's unsustainable. We need to look at the right freedom, the transcendent freedom, and that's the freedom to choose the right responsibility. Today we are locked in our houses because of the COVID lockdown, and we can't even go out to find food for our families. We have been denied the responsibility to provide for our families. But instead of screaming out loud against this abuse of freedom, we are crying for human rights, talking about funny things like our businesses and things like that. We need to look deeper. By denying us freedom to find food for our families and denying us responsibility, they deny us virtue. Without virtue, we can't be sovereign individuals. And if we are not sovereign individuals or identified as such, then we don't deserve any rights. So however much we cry for rights, we will never get rights, because rights are only given to the responsible. Rights are only deserved by the responsible. So the African youth have to very quickly understand that the war that has been waged against us is the war that stops us from identifying and contending with the right evils, choosing the right responsibility. We need to wake up from this stupor and begin choosing the right responsibility. How we solve African problems is our responsibility. The faster we take up this responsibility and begin solving these problems, the faster we'll have a better Africa. And to contend with African problems begins by uniting. So I'll stop at this by saying, first, the African youth need to spearhead the unification of Africa, because there we lump up all the African problems and we know our boundaries for where our responsibility stops. And then we begin cutting that dragon into more manageable pieces at the individual level. And each and every individual African youth can then tackle a problem. We need to love our motherland, and we need to be able to negotiate a habitable order out of the chaos in Africa today. This chaos we are responsible for. This chaos is our fault because we've not done anything to resolve this problem. We have been derailed and mind controlled and fooled into looking at the wrong problem. And this is the biggest violation of African freedom. We've been denied the freedom to choose the right responsibilities. And we've been taught to contend with European problems as though they were African problems, pushing us into that aid. Like complacent infants. because that's what they do. So we have the overprotective mom that won't let an African touch any significant responsibility, and we have the tyrant African army that is too disciplinarian. It stops African children from breathing, from risking, from growing. And that's why you see we have the infant generation before our generation. It's time for us to wake up and choose the right responsibilities. We have no business solving global problems because all our problems are African problems, and it's upon us to begin solving these problems. The wars and killings and the warlords. Let's join the army. Let's create an African United Army, because an African United Army can solve any militia problem in Africa. Let's unite as Africa and give the black race an identity to be proud of. Because when you're Uganda, when you're Kenya, when you're Tanzania, when you're Rwanda, when you're Nigeria, when you're Libya, when you're Egypt, when you're Somalia, you're just one village in the world. But when you're Africa, you're the richest continent. When you're Africa, you're rich even economically, even in the modern way. When you're Africa, you have thousands of planes. When you're Africa, you're a proud sovereign race. Divided, we are weak. United, we are strong. And we have a clear purpose and a clear sense of our responsibility. This is how we regain our freedom. And it's upon us to regain this freedom, because no one will give us this freedom. We have to empower ourselves with such knowledge. We have to empower ourselves by identifying the dragons to contend with, and start slowly. We can't begin to deal with European dragons. Those are two big dragons we can't handle at the moment. We need to deal with the smaller dragons within our reach. But our dragons are loose because we have been derailed from our responsibilities. That's why we need to unite very quickly and very fast, so that we are able to then cut down these dragons into smaller managements that we can handle at the individual level, so that we have a generation of African youth that have meaningful life, that have noble purpose, that have a discipline and a responsibility that deals with African problems, that are incorruptible and can't be bought to betray Africa, that love Africa, that are proud of Africa, that love one another. This is the Africa that we desire. This is the Africa that we can create. We'll talk more about this, but in brief, that's how the African youth has been denied freedom. Thank you, guys.